Trolls.
They're eating her! And then they're going to eat me! Oh my God!
Something that's not really discussed a whole lot in heathenry, despite its popularity in the lore. And when you read the lore and you look up stuff about trolls, there's kind of a common theme that you notice. Otherisation. And I have deemed it trollification. That's what the ancestors were doing. They were otherizing certain people. Like in a previous video, I mentioned that homeless people could be otherized and trollificated, which is a word I'm pretty sure I made up. It wasn't just the people living on the outskirts of society. There's a Finnish queen. She was considered a troll woman because they thought she was a witch. Save actually most likely comes from the Sami people. If you're not familiar with the Sami people, they are the native people to Finland. Whenever the Scandinavian people migrated up there, they were already there. They're the reindeer herders. In her society, she was obviously a prominent person. She's a queen, right? So she's not on the outskirts of her society. She was simply considered an enemy of people in that saga. And certain, like berserker could be considered trolls. There's one saga instance where there's a guy who has like a stone pendant on, and this guy like swings his sword or whatever it was, and it strikes the stone, and he accuses the guy being a troll because his sword didn't hurt the guy. That's that otherization. I think it's pretty important to not only as a society look at trolls and otherization in general, but to understand what that means and why we do it as people. Like this day and age, it's extremely easy to otherize, to trollify. Religion, there's a lot of pagans that dislike Christianity and Christians. There's a lot of religious people that dislike atheists, a lot of anti-theists that dislike religious people. Well, one of the big reasons being that they otherize. They see them as something different than themselves. It's really important to see people as just people. Here in Humboldt County, homeless people are a huge issue. It dominates many of the groups on the interwebs. It's just kind of a large source of crime, and I mean, you see them every day driving down the streets. It's such a common occurrence. I'm originally from Sacramento, and I mean, down there, it was rare to see homeless people. Like, you see them every now and then. Somebody that looked like the homeless people up here wasn't always a homeless person down there. Whereas like up here, most likely, and many of us are one bad day away from being homeless, or one lack of paycheck, one car accident, one medical issue. It's very important to humanize people and not see them as troll, see them as other. I mean, politics is a pretty good example. I'm not going to get political, but I am going to define why we shouldn't hate each other so much. No matter what your political ideology is, if you dehumanize somebody, of course you're not going to realize that this is another human being with a different perception than you, a different upbringing than you, different values than you. And a lot of those values are created by the environment they grew up in, the things they have seen, the things they've experienced. I was a lot more liberal when I went into the military, and I was a lot more conservative when I went out of the military. That's another thing, is people around you can massively affect your ideology. We as people tend to have a herd mentality, and we want to fit in. And that's why a lot of the times, like, someone will see the narrative, whatever the popular narrative is at the time, or the popular narrative around them, and then they'll follow that. So there could be a multitude of factors as to why people have ideas that are different than your own. Maybe they don't have all the knowledge you have. Maybe they're distrustful of science and different establishments, not because they're a paranoid loon, but because they've been let down by many of those establishments. Because I was in the military, saw government firsthand and dealt with a lot of the bureaucracy and the machinations of bureaucracy, how long things take, and the fact that I had more classes on sexual harassment and finance than my own MOS. MOS, by the way, is military occupational specialty. It's a fancy term for job. It was insanely bureaucratic. Because of seeing that, that's definitely influenced my more libertarian ideology today. It's not that I don't care about people. I think obviously from these videos, you can tell that I care about people. Just the machinations of bureaucracy let me down a little. You see like these Antifa people and alt-right people, and they're just so anti each other. We all need to start realizing that we're all just using our perception, our value systems, what we see, what we do influences these ideologies that we have and tend to cling to. And we're all just trying to make the world a little bit better. We just disagree on what that means. My wife is a lot more lefty than I am. She sees the government as being more of a tool for betterment than I do. That doesn't mean we get into knockdown, drag out fights because our ideologies are different. No, we discuss them. If they do get heated, then it's time to kind of step back, maybe revisit the topic. But the important thing is to realize that we both care. We don't just have belief systems that are all about hate. Same thing with religion. You can't fault a Christian for their ideology if they got off drugs, right? Like my dad, for example, is very religious, and he used to be an addict. Likewise, when my grandmother passed, and then my grandfather passed the next year, he became even a little bit more religious. That's a coping mechanism, but it's also something that he has used to make his life better. So who am I to tell him he's wrong? Do I disagree with some of the things in Christianity? Obviously, I'm not Christian. Us pagans, a lot of our family members and our ancestors, our more direct ancestors, are Christians. In the bloat circle, all hail my grandfather, or maybe my great-grandfather, or my grandmother, and these more immediate ancestors, and they're Christians. I'm giving worth to Christians in the bloat circle. Very pagan thing. It's very important to not trollify. It's definitely difficult. I've mentioned this in a couple of videos now. Insecurity, and we deal with the homeless population quite a bit. So it can be very easy to disregard them. I mean, I've talked to some guards that have pretty out there ideologies when it comes to the homeless population specifically. And have that thought. I've mentioned both my parents have had addiction issues. I, for a little while growing up, didn't actually have a stable residence. I never slept on the street. Not as a kid. A couple nights as an adult, but that's a different story and involves poor decisions mostly. There was a time in my life where my mother was just bouncing around from her friend's house to her friend's house. The only thing stable in my life was the fact that my grandparents had a pretty stable place. I know from my experience that it doesn't take much to be in a bad situation. My mother had a house, I remember when I was very young, and we were there for a few years, and then because she was with this abusive guy, he wouldn't leave the house. I was too young to remember any of the legalities, and this is like, late 80s, early 90s? Because he wouldn't leave the house, we ended up having to go too, and from that point forward, we just didn't have a solid residence until many years later when my mother got clean. When I was about 9 or so, bouncing around from school to school. A lot of these homeless people are forced in that situation because of broken homes, mental illness, addiction, things that really they should be getting help for, but because of a lack of resources, or maybe they don't know about something. When I was doing hospital security, I heard about this one guy. I want to say there was a social worker or something that was working with him. And he, when he was like 9 years old, left because he was in an abusive home. And because of that situation, was forced into the lifestyle that he was in. I mean, that's absolutely insane. I don't know if he was exactly 9 or not because I can't remember. But I mean, that's insane. I can't imagine even like somebody that's like 12 or 13 being out on the streets, let alone a 9-year-old. And like some of the politicians that we want to hate or we disagree with, a lot of times it's easy to otherize them too. Maybe if they're in long enough, they might become corrupt or what we see as corrupt. But unless we fully understand a situation, we shouldn't really judge somebody. I mean, obviously there's exceptions. Blatant corruption is blatant corruption. But that doesn't mean that just because they have an ideology that's different than yours, that you should slam them. What's that one gal that might run for president soon? Liz Warren. There's a lot of stuff I don't agree with that she says, but that doesn't mean that I don't like the fact that she's putting it to some of these banks and stuff. So yeah, it just comes down to perception. And I mean, these are things that I harp on, I think, in basically every video. Account the perception of others, our personal bias, and we really just can't otherize. A lot of these extremists, that's what they do. Whether you're white supremacist or jihadi or Antifa, all these people, they just otherize. And in their heads, they're turning these people into villains. It's easy to see somebody who doesn't fit into your in-group as troll. Couple of terms in heathenry: inner yard and outer yard. Inner garden, utgard. Inner yard is your immediate in-group, close family, close friends, your kindred if you have one. And then there's outer yard. Outer yard is like outside that wall. You'll notice Utgard and Asgard have a similarity there, as well as Midgard. Well, guard, which means yard, can also denote the wall, right? That barrier between us and them. I'm not saying, of course, let everybody into your inner yard regardless of character, because obviously that would be a horrible idea. That being said, we can't vilify everybody in that outer yard. Most people that act in some kind of negative way are acting out of some form of desperation. The reason homeless people steal or dig through your trash, any of those things is desperation, which is unfortunate. Just because somebody is outer yard doesn't mean that they're evil automatically. Using the lore, the three major families of archetypal deities are the Aesir, the Vanir, and the Jotnar. Your celestial deities, your wilderness deities, and then your chaos deities, which is a rough but I think direct way to define them. You might see in the lore vilifying or seeing this group is bad and that group is good, but when it comes down to it, the Aesir, Jotnar, and Vanir, they all intermarry. Skadi, who in the lore is Njord's wife, is considered through unverifiable personal gnosis, UPG. UPG is essentially thoughts and feelings people have had, or maybe shamanic journeys in some cases, kind of fill in some of the gaps in the lore. It's believed that Skadi and Ullr are married because they're more like each other. According to the lore, Skadi and Njord, the seafaring god of the sea, the god of seafaring, they're married. But yeah, Skadi was a giantess, Jotun being the singular and Jotnar being the plural. And then in the earlier part of the lore, the Vanir and the Aesir, when they first encounter each other, they fight. There's one giantess, Golveg, who some people interpret as Freya. Not really incited, but had aroused the ire of the Aesir, put her to the flame, and ended up pissing off the Vanir, and then they started that war. So there's a conflict, but now we consider Freya, Frey, and Njord, who are all Vanir gods, part of that main bulk of pantheon. Freya is extremely popular, but she's not part of the Aesir. So we can see lessons in that. So the next time you feel the urge to vilify somebody, or to just write them off as evil or bad, evil is relative. To the wolf, starving is evil, but to the sheep, being eaten is evil. It's really just relative. In fact, the dichotomy of order and chaos actually makes more sense than good and evil. It's so easy to see somebody as other and not realize that they have the same struggles you do, same fears, some of the same thoughts, some of the same dreams. We all want recognition and to be seen as human and not troll. Please, if you have any more to add to this topic, comment below. Let's start a discussion. So really, it's an interesting topic that I don't think gets talked about enough in heathenry. Like, subscribe, comment, do the thing. Skull.